Hello and welcome back to the channel. So let's continue our discussion on the cervical fascia. In the previous video, we'd seen the superficial fascia and the deep fascia. We'd seen that it surrounds the neck like a collar and is also called the fascia coli. And in the interval between the muscles, vessels, and organs of the cervical region, it gives various extension and laminae which surround the various structures of the neck. We'd seen its 7 modifications, which were the investing layer, the pretracheal layer, the prevertebral layer, the carotid sheath, the buccopharyngeal fascia, the temporal fascia, and the pharyngobasilar fascia. We'd also talked in detail about the investing layer of the deep fascia and all of its attachments and all the clinically relevant points related to it. So in this video, we are going to continue talking about the pretracheal fascia and the prevertebral fascia. But before I get into these, I want to highlight the way that it has been classified in Gray's anatomy. Okay, so when we go through Gray's, we see that they have categorized the deep fascia into 3 layers, which are the superficial layer, the middle layer, and the deep layer. The superficial layer consists of the investing layer of deep fascia, as we have already covered, which encloses the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now the difference comes in the middle layer. Okay, the middle layer is further categorized into the muscular layer and the visceral layer. The muscular layer encloses all the infrahyoid strap muscles, which are the sternohyoid, the sternothyroid, the omohyoid, and the thyrohyoid. Okay, so the middle layer, the first part of it is the muscular layer enclosing the infrahyoid strap muscles. The second part of it is the visceral layer, which encloses all the important viscera of the neck. Now, this has been further categorized as the pretracheal fascia and the buccopharyngeal fascia. So the pretracheal fascia encloses the larynx, the trachea, the thyroid gland, and posteriorly continues as the buccopharyngeal fascia, which encloses the buccinator and the posterior wall of the pharynx. Okay, now finally we've covered the superficial layer, the middle layer. Finally, we have the deep layer. Okay, so the deep layer is almost always synonymous with the prevertebral layer, which has 2 parts: an anterior part, which is called the alar fascia, and a posterior part, which is the prevertebral fascia. In between the prevertebral, which is the posterior, and the alar fascia, which is the anterior, we have the prevertebral space. And anterior to the alar fascia is the retropharyngeal space. So with this knowledge in mind, let's begin forward by talking about the pretracheal fascia. And I'll give you more details on the layers mentioned in the deep layer as in when we come to it. So let's begin by talking about the pretracheal fascia. Now the pretracheal fascia, as I told you before, is one of the visceral layers of the neck. So it covers the larynx and the trachea and splits to enclose the thyroid gland, forming a false surgical capsule. So you can see in this diagram, it runs inferior to the sternohyoid and the sternothyroid and covers the larynx, the trachea, and also splits to enclose the thyroid gland. Now in the transverse section of the neck, you can see that it arises from the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, enclosing the larynx and the trachea. Now its attachments by this knowledge are quite easy to visualize, right? So superiorly we see it extends from the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage more laterally. So let me show you in this diagram the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, and the cricoid cartilage, which is posterior to the thyroid gland. As it comes downward, it forms a false capsule around the thyroid gland, and inferior to the thyroid gland, it passes behind the brachiocephalic veins and continues into the superior mediastinum, fusing with the fibrous pericardium. Okay, so it extending from the hyoid, thyroid cartilage, thyroid gland into the superior mediastinum, fusing with the fibrous pericardium. Now in the transverse section, we see that on either side, it fuses with the front of the carotid sheath. So it is also believed to contribute to the anterior part of the carotid sheath. Now, because of its attachments, there are a lot of clinically relevant points related to it. Okay, so let's begin by talking about its relation to the superior mediastinum and the fibrous pericardium. Okay, first of all, enlargement of the thyroid gland leads to embarrassment of the heart as the lower extension of the pretracheal fascia is the pericardium, right? And secondly, a collection of pus situated beneath the superficial layer in the anterior portion of the neck may enter the chest, being guided into the anterior mediastinum by the pretracheal fascia, right? Both these points are because of its inferior extension being the fibrous pericardium. Now, as we say that as it comes downwards and as it forms a false capsule around the thyroid gland, we see that on the posterior aspect related to the cricoid cartilage, on either side it forms a thickening which is called the suspensory ligament for the thyroid gland or the suspensory ligament of Berry. So it is attached chiefly to the cricoid cartilage and supports the thyroid gland and does not let it sink into the mediastinum. Okay, so as it's coming downward, on the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, there's a thickening which attaches it to the cricoid cartilage, which is known as the suspensory ligament of Berry, which supports the thyroid gland and does not let it sink into the mediastinum. Now, because of this reason, the thyroid gland moves up and down with deglutition, as and when the cricoid cartilage moves up and down, right? So when we swallow, the hyoid bone moves up, and along with it, the pretracheal fascia and the cartilages of the larynx. So, which is why the thyroid gland also moves up and down with deglutition. Also, in thyroid surgeries, the ligament of Berry has to be cut to be able to mobilize the thyroid gland. Okay, so finally, our last point in the anatomy of the pretracheal fascia is, as you can see in the transverse section, we see that the fascia forms the outer false capsule of the thyroid gland, but the posterior part of it is not well defined. Hence, thyroid swellings grow posteriorly and may compress the esophagus, causing dysphagia. So with this, we actually complete talking about the pretracheal fascia. Let's go over it once again. Pretracheal fascia is one of the layers of the visceral layer of the neck. It encloses the larynx, trachea, and the thyroid gland. Its attachments were the hyoid, thyroid cartilage, cricoid, thyroid, and the fibrous pericardium. And laterally, it fuses with the front of the carotid sheath. And we saw its relation to the cricoid cartilage by the suspensory ligament of Berry, and also that the posterior part of it is not well defined, and hence thyroid swellings can go posteriorly, causing dysphagia. So now we'll continue talking about the prevertebral fascia. Now, prevertebral fascia basically forms a tubular investment of the vertebral column and its muscles, and covers the prevertebral muscles and forms the floor of the posterior triangle. So, when we were talking about the investing layer, we saw that as it encloses the trapezius, at the anterior border of the trapezius, as it continues forwards, it formed the roof of the posterior triangle. Now, the prevertebral fascia is one of the processes which is which is one of the posterior processes given from the anterior border of the trapezius. And this forms the floor of the posterior triangle. Okay.